Okay, so I always like to give a little introduction about me, Moses Gabriel Omolaye. You can call me Mo, very easy to remember. So my name is Moses, and I am an information security specialist, and I function in the area of GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. I'm also certified to the ISO 27001 lead implementer, lead auditor. I'm a lead auditor for ISO 22301, which is business continuity. I'm also a certified data protection officer, and I'm also a certified AI management system lead implementer, which is the ISO 42001, amongst other certifications around information security, networking, IT and information security audits, and risk assessment. And beyond my certifications and background in computer science, I also have extensive experience in network security, systems admin, business process management, and right now information security management. So that's what, so I would say that my cumulative experience made it easier to function even better right now. And I can tell you that regardless of your background, regardless of where you're coming from, today could be the start of your trajectory into information security. So before we go into this, I want us to disabuse our minds of something. When people want to transit and then someone tells you that he wants to or they want to introduce you to non-technical IT or non-technical information security, and I tell people that I do not agree with that description. Why? Because you must understand the technical, even at a base level, before you can even say that you can function well as either a risk assessor, an auditor, an implementer. Because what are you implementing if you do not understand how the systems work? So that's the first thing. We need to disabuse our minds of that impression. So now we're going right into the crux of the matter. Information security management systems. So what are we going to look at? We'll look at foundations. We'll look at some key terms. We'll look at the ISO 27000 family. We'll look at 27001 specifically. We'll look at implementation, the phases of implementation, and then we'll look at what we call the Annex A controls and the attributes, and then what you would need to know around starting off in information security. So we're going to look at some core concepts like information, like asset, risk, the CIA triad, and what an ISMS is. So this is like the bedrock of information security. So why does it even matter? Why does information security matter? Because organizations, regardless of the type, the business type, or the size of the organization, they depend on information as a critical asset. So information, I mean, organizations, first of all, collect and process information. So they, I mean, in different forms, whether it's by doing an invoice with people and they're getting people's details, or by sending out emails, exchanging one way or the other, organizations continuously collect data, they process data, they store it, and then they transmit information across functions. And then also, organizations recognize assets because, you know, information is an asset. It is as valuable as the skyscraper, in some cases even more valuable than that real estate. So you recognize assets like information, the processes, systems, networks, and people are recognized as important assets for achieving objectives. So if you don't have the right information, you don't have the right processes or the right systems, or your networks are not in place, and you don't even have the right people in place to achieve the objectives, then that means you do not have the right assets. And organizations would always face risks. They don't have to materialize, but they would always face risks. So every organization would always, I mean, at some point or the other, face a range of threats and vulnerabilities that can affect the functioning of their assets. So, for instance, if the vulnerability of your staff not being properly trained could bring up the threat of wrong inputs and wrong processing because they are not properly trained. Then, so when you recognize your risks, you also would, when you recognize your risks, you also would implement controls. Now, what are controls? Controls are used to address risk exposure. You know, if there are possible risks, what do we need to put in place for those risks to be mitigated? Basically, that's what controls are. And then in information security, we have what we call the CIA triad. It is what is the bedrock of information security. So we have C, which stands for confidentiality, I stands for integrity, and A stands for availability. Now, confidentiality, it means that only authorized individuals, entities, or processes will the information be made available to. That is why we have things like encryption, we have things like access control, and that's why we sign non-disclosure agreements. Then we have integrity. So this is, so with integrity, it just tells us that your data has to be complete and accurate. Sometimes it can be accurate but not complete. Sometimes it can be complete but not accurate. Let me give an example. If I say Moses asked Daniel, I tell you, tell Daniel to meet me at the bus stop by 4 p.m. And you say, Moses said you should meet him at the bus stop. Is that accurate? Yes. But is it complete? No, because you didn't say by 4 p.m. Sorry, it's not complete, but it's accurate. But if you say, Moses said you should meet him at the bus park at 3 p.m. Is the message complete? Yes, but is it accurate? No, it is not. And that is why we have things like version controls. When you write a policy and you have to rewrite, you always have to put the version, maybe version 1, version 2, so that there isn't a mix-up on the most recent version. Now, what is availability? It means that data or information has to be accessible, one, and also usable when authorized entities need the information. So that is, we have things like backup, so that where there's an eventuality, backups can be activated, and we have redundancies, secondary and primary systems to kick in when the primary system is down. It fails over to the secondary. And then we have disaster recovery too, recovering from a disaster. So there are some additional properties. That means your data must be authentic, and then there must be accountability and non-repudiation in place. Non-repudiation is a case where that is why you have like server logs, so that when you do something, you cannot deny. When we go to the logs, we see that by 2 p.m. on Thursday, the 16th of November 2024, Moses logged in and changed a user's password. So non-repudiation doesn't give you the chance to deny what you have done when you've actually done it. And then reliability is also part of it. So we need to understand information security risks. So because they are very key. They are very key. Because they're very key. So basically, what is a risk? A risk is the effect of uncertainty on an objective. I would explain. Now, this is the definition from the ISO 27000 document. It's basically a vocabulary document. So, how you calculate risk is the consequence or the impact of that risk times the likelihood. What is the likelihood that the risk would happen? So now when we talk of information security risk, basically this is the potential that a threat or threats would exploit vulnerabilities of an information asset and will cause harm to the organization. So a threat cannot act unless there's a vulnerability. I'll give an instance. If the vulnerability is you not locking your door, God forbid, and you go to sleep, there's a possible threat. The threat actor will possibly be a thief that can take advantage of that vulnerability, step into your house, and steal things and go. So there are certain things we need to understand. So a threat is a potential cause of unwanted incident, like I just described. A vulnerability is a weakness that can be exploited, like I just described with the open door. And the consequence or impact, the impact is the consequence to the organization, or the consequence is the impact to the organization. I mean, they both mean the same thing. If that risk materializes, what is the possible impact? Then we have the risk treatment options. So where there are risks, you can avoid risks, meaning that you can cut off that process that brings up that risk totally, or you can reduce the risk, put mitigants, like mitigate the risk to the barest minimum. Because I tell people risk is like poverty. It cannot be eradicated, but it can be reduced. Or you can transfer the risk. That's why people sign up to things like insurance or getting third parties to do certain things for you. And then you can accept the risk. That means if the organization has seen that this risk is within the organization's risk appetite, then it can be accepted. So, that being said, what is an ISMS? An Information Security Management System. So, an Information Security Management System, or ISMS for short, is basically a systematic approach for 1, establishing, 2, implementing, 3, operating, 4, monitoring, reviewing, maintaining, and improving an organization's information security to do what? To achieve business objectives. So, first of all, you have to understand the objectives and the context of the organization so you know what you're trying to achieve. And with the ISMS, there's the implementation method, which is called the PDCA. which is the plan, do, check, and act. So in the plan phase, you establish the context of the organization. We won't go deep into that because it's above the scope of this foundation course. Then you assess risks, then you set objectives. So after assessing the risk, the possible risk, then you set the objectives, the organizational objectives for the ISMS. Then you do, based on the risk assessment, context establishment, and setting of objectives, you implement the ISMS, then you operate the controls that you have put in place and the processes. Now, how did you get the right controls to use during the assessment, during the risk assessments and context establishment and objective setting? So when you do that exercise, you would now see that you can choose the controls and processes to help achieve those objectives. Then you check, you monitor, measure, audit, and review. So after implementing, you run it for a while. You do things like internal audits, so that if there are any gaps, you can note them down, and it takes us to the next phase, which is to act, meaning that after you've done your checks, if there are any gaps, you improve and update the ISMS continually. So that is why you see that things like audits are done annually, biannually, just depending on what the management chooses as an organization. So what are the components of an ISMS? An ISMS, first of all, policies must be in place. And what are policies? So a policy is just a documented information security. So you must have a documented information security policy that reflects the organization's commitment. Without this, there's no ISMS. You must have an information security policy, or an IS policy as it is called. Then you have to define responsibilities. So within the ISMS, you have to define who is responsible for what, and those roles and responsibilities must be appropriately communicated to the affected people and organization wide. Then management process. Now, policy establishment is a management process because, yes, someone can draft, but it is the management that approves and pushes out. Then awareness is a management process. You have to do the security awareness and all of that, and make sure that people are aware of the ISMS program and what it entails. Then the planning, of course, it is management that would approve resources, be it financial, be it personnel resources, whatever. That's a management process. And then there's no implementation without management. And then operating the ISMS, then review and improvement. So the number one thing we need when running an ISMS is management and backing. So that must be there. Then documented information. So everything has to be documented. I used to have a boss that would tell me, if it's not documented, it doesn't exist. So you must have your records, your policies, procedures, and where required, evidences so there are some requirements by the standard, and then you need evidences to back those requirements, either the availability of those things or the lack of the availability. Then information security risk assessment, that is key. So why do you do the information security risk assessment? You do it so that you can identify, analyze, and evaluate information security risks. So after you get the information security risks, you select controls. You have to do the risk treatment, and you select the appropriate controls and implement the controls. So one place that you get a good number of controls from is what we call the Annex A controls. We would see some of that as we go on. So In the ISO 27 family, which the 27001 belongs to, you have a wide range. So there are more than 70 standards. Some are vocabulary documents, like we saw from the definition of, when we started, of information of the ISMS. Then we have the requirements documents, like the ISO 27001. Then you have guidance documents. You have the sector specific. So there you see some things within information security specific to telecommunications, to health, we have that too. And then you have conformity assessment. There's a document for, or there's a standard for organizations that want to assess, or bodies that want to assess organizations when it comes to information security. So we'll just look at some. So the vocabulary document, which is the 27,000, it shows us things like overview, the terms and definitions, and this is free. Then we have the requirements document. You have things like the 27001, 27006. So they are all requirements documents. So for the purpose of this class, we're looking at 27001, which basically gives you the guidelines on how to implement an information security management system. And in this, in the 27,000 body, the 27,001 is basically the only standard that is certifiable, that an organization can certify to. The other ones, you could get things like attestations, but for certification, it's the 27,001. So we now have guidelines. So we have the 27,002. What does the 27,002 do? So those Annex A controls that you see in the 27,001, they are just guides on how you should implement those controls, for instance, those controls. So if you're having difficulty, you can just go to the 27,002 document, and then it could give you a guidance. Then we have sector specific. You have whether it's cloud, energy, telecoms. So some of these are some sector specific ISO standards. Then, so these are some key standards. We spoke about the vocabulary. We've spoken about the 27,001, the requirements documents for your ISMS. 27,002 is a reference set of the 93 controls, information security controls, and it gives you an implementation guide, like I said. And then we have the ISO 27005, which speaks to information security risk. So it just guides you on how to assess and treat information security aligned to the ISO 27001. Then we have the 27701, which is the privacy, and it's just an extension of the ISO 27001, 27002, and this is privacy information management systems. So it covers things like personally identifiable identities, how you can control and process that. Just like, and we see that things like the NDPA, GDPR, it draws concepts from this basically. So why would you want to choose the ISO 27001 on the information security management system? So there are a couple of reasons. Now, it's universal. Regardless of the size of the organization, the type of the organization, the industry or the location, the ISO 27001 is applicable. And then it is simple and short. It's not, they don't beat around the bush. It's just 21 pages for the requirements document. So it's not a very big document. So it's concise and easy to understand. And then it also aligns with other management systems like business continuity, privacy, quality management. And in fact, it can even integrate with other frameworks that are non-ISO, like NIST and all of that. And then it's time tested. So it dates as back as 1995, even before it was called the ISO 27001. It was called 7799-1. And then it has sound principles. So the principles around the ISO 27001 are sound. Things like leadership commitment, continual improvement. It has a risk-based approach too. And then it's a rich ecosystem. So it has extensive guidelines, courses, there's consulting support everywhere you look. Even companies like ours that mitigate it, we do all of that. And there are professional communities, some of which I belong to. And then it's certifiable, like I said. So you can certify the organizations that certify to that help that assess and certify organizations to ISO 27001, of which we are also drivers of that as a company that mitigate it. And then industry influence. It inspires other frameworks like NIST, like the NIST Cybersecurity framework, the SOC 2, and other frameworks. And it speaks a common language. So there isn't a variance of lingua, you know. It shares the same terminology, and it makes collaboration easier. Now, what are some benefits? It helps to improve the overall security posture, helps for better incident response, and giving your organization cyber resilient. And then it helps to raise awareness and information, and gives an information security culture to the organization, and it helps to reduce business risks. And then also it helps to build stakeholder trust. So a lot of times you see where an organization wants to do business and they are asking, are you certified to ISO 27001 or some other ISO? Can you give us proof? So it builds stakeholder trust, because they believe that once that is in place, it means some processes and procedures have been put in place. And it complies with legal, regulatory, and contractual needs. It actually complies with it. Like, even when you look at things like the Nigerian Data Protection Act or the GDPR or the one for California and India, you'd see that components from here already help to align the organization in the right direction to meet those regulatory standards, or to be compliant with them. And then common approach to multiple security requirements. There isn't a different approach each time. And then it helps to increase the maturity of IT, HR, and governance processes, because continual improvement is one of the major things. It's like at the end of the cycle, and you start all over again, and it still ends at continual improvement every other time. And then greater transparency in security budget justification. So if you're trying to justify your budgets, security budgets for the organization, I mean, there's more transparency here. For instance, we need to implement these controls. These controls, we need us to buy probably appliances, probably get expertise. Now that is justifiable because there's something to back it. And the marketing opportunities and competitive advantage. As a practice, this has affected us directly. Why do I say it has affected us directly? We get business every other time. I'll give an instance. We have implemented in less than 2 years, we've done over 15 of these implementations. And that's to tell you the viability of this, of the information security management systems or management systems in general, because you have it's more and more, or it's becoming a need every single day. And as a company, it gives a competitive advantage. If you're pitching for a job and you are certified to ISO 27001, another company isn't, I mean, that alone can give you the edge over this. It can give you the edge over the next company. So this survey is from 2021. It's quite an old survey, but it's just to let us see that this is a very, very applicable. So we had over 1 million organizations certified to quality management, which is 9001. We can see other ones. So our focus is ISO 27001. Now, between 2020 and 2021, you can see the growth. In 2020, we had about 44,486 organizations certified. However, we can see that in 2021, between 2021 and 2020, the number increased to over 58,000. And as of now, that number has probably doubled or more. Then you can see that at 2021, over or almost 100,000 sites, organizations were certified to the ISO 27001. That says a lot about this. So, for you to implement, there are different phases of implementation. There are 5 phases. Now, the document has what we call clauses. There are 10 clauses, but the first 3 clauses cannot be auditable because it speaks to like the introduction, it speaks to vocabulary, and then references. So it is from clauses 4 to 10 that the implementation starts. So what are the phases of the implementation? You have to understand the context of the organization. What does that mean? It means that you need to understand the needs of the organization, and then after doing that, you establish an information security policy and the objectives for the information security objectives. Then you do a risk assessment, which we have said would help you to identify, analyze, and evaluate information security risks across all assets. Then you implement controls. So what are controls? They could be processes, they could be, there are different types of controls which we would see. And they are aimed at treating identified risks. Then you monitor. After implementation, you monitor and then you review the effectiveness of what has been implemented. And based on your review, whatever needs to be tweaked, needs to be improved upon, will be improved upon. And then you now practice continual improvement. Now this, so if you want to see more about the implementation phases, the reference document is ISO 27003. Basically, it gives a detailed guide on all the implementation phases. So what are some required activities based on the clauses? Clause 4 is called the context of the organization. So what are the things that need to be done? You have to determine the external and internal issues that could affect the outcome of the information security. So it could be external, could be things like regulatory bodies and all of that, laws. Internal could be training, capacity. Then you identify interested parties and their information security requirements. Stakeholders, staff are interested parties too. Then you determine the scope and boundaries of their ISMS. So sometimes when implementing, you can say you want it to be implemented company-wide, or there are only certain functions and departments it should be implemented to, or there are certain branches. Then you establish, implement, and maintain continually improve the ISMS. Then clause 5 is leadership. So top management has to demonstrate leadership and commitment to the ISMS. So top management would establish an information security policy, and then roles and responsibilities will be crafted, and their authorities will be assigned to them and communicated appropriately. Then clause 6 is planning. So you determine risks and opportunities. When we say opportunities for improvement. So you define a risk assessment and a risk treatment process. So before you do a risk assessment, you must have a documentation that shows the process with which you used to do the risk assessment. Then you establish an information security objectives, or you establish objectives of information security and how to achieve them. And then you plan and manage changes to the ISMS in a structured manner. Then we have support. Now, management has to support with resources, providing what is needed to run the ISMS, ensure that persons are qualified, the competence, and then awareness must be part of it. Staff need to understand their roles and the policy, the information security policy, and other security-centric policies. And then communication. There must be a definition of the communication channels and how things would be communicated. And then, of course, the document information. And that is very key. Information must be documented. Like I said, if it's not documented, it doesn't exist. This is evidence-based, and evidence documentation builds up to evidence. Then you operate. Clause 8 is operation. So you execute the plan that you've come up with, and then you manage both planned and unplanned changes to the ISMS. Then you perform the risk assessment, and you have to retain results, again, evidence. And then you implement the risk treatment plan. Again, you have to keep records. Then you perform evaluation. So you monitor, you measure, then you analyze and evaluate the performance of the information security. And then you do an internal audit, because based on the internal audit, you know what is in conformity and what is not in conformity. And then management will review. And based on the results from management review, which will be done periodically, the continual improvement is activated. So that has to be done, continual improvement of the information security management system. Now, if there are non-conformities, you have to manage them properly. You have to take action, correct what needs to be corrected, and react what needs to be reacted to. So we have what we call the Annex A controls in ISO 27001, information security controls. So before there used to be, I think, 114, they've been shrunk to 93. Don't forget that the climate is changing. So before, for instance, cybersecurity was not an in-depth consideration in the ISO standard, but when the 2022 version came out, because of the climate, that had to be included. So we have organizational controls. So we have in Annex A5, A6, A7, A8. A5 are organizational controls. We have 37 of that. A6 are people controls. We have 8 of that. A7 are physical controls. We have 14 of that. And A8 are technological controls, where we have 34 of that. So these are just some examples of the controls. So, for instance, in Annex A5, we have 5.1, which is policies for information security, the different policies that are that are in line with information security. And you can see some of the things they added here, like threat intelligence, which was not there before, cloud services. Then we have A6, which is people controls, when HR is screening people before employment, in terms of employment, remote working, how is it handled, and what's the disciplinary process. Then we have physical controls, things like your physical perimeter. Do you have how are they monitored? Do you have locks? Do you have guards? All those things. Then you have technological controls, configuration management. Do you mask your data? What happens in the case of data leakage and all of that? And that is around technological controls. So there are different attributes when it comes to these controls. The first is the control type. So it could be preventive, it could be detective, it could be corrective. Then we have the information security properties. Which of them does it primarily protect? Is it the confidentiality? Is it the integrity? Is it the availability? Then we have the cybersecurity concepts. Now, this is aligned to the NIST cybersecurity framework functions, where you identify, you protect, you detect, you respond, or recover. Then operational capabilities is just asking what operational area does the control support? Is it government? Is it governance? Sorry. Is it asset management? Is it information security events? Is it legal, etc.? And then we have security domains. What security domain does that control belong to? So high-level security domain that the control falls under. It could be under resilience, it could be under defense, it could be under protection, and also governance. So, where do we start from? Basically, you just need to know about the ISMS, and these are some practical steps, knowing like we've done right now. And then before we even go to the part of implementation, you need to properly get trained to either implement or to audit, and all of that. So what you need to know about the ISMS. So number one is that the requirements now this is a fact, the requirements in the ISO 27001 are generic. As much as they are generic, they are flexible because, like we said, they apply to any size of organization, any sector, and then they're applicable to all types of organizations, like we said. In fact, two is that the ISMS focuses on interested parties. So it's about identifying who cares about your information security: stakeholders, staff, etc., business partners. And then fact three, the ISMS uses a risk-based approach. So controls are selected based on specific risks. That's why we do the risk assessment. And then something that is key is that the ISMS is about processes and continual improvement, not a one-time project. So it is not something that is not a project, it's a program, because the project has a start and end date. So it's not just something you implement and that is it. And then processes are more important than policies and documents. So start collecting evidence now. So don't focus on certification first, implement the process. So typically they'll tell you 1 to 2 years, but for instance, I mitigate it. We've come up with a framework to help you get your organizational certification a lot quicker than is stipulated here. And then tip 7, implementing an ISMS is a long, complex project. So go to top management or get the top management commitment early, so nothing comes in the way. So what are the things you need to do for the implementation? You start the conversation, you discuss with top management and the appropriate things, get their buy-in, you get the standard. The standard isn't free, only the vocabulary standard is free. You invest in training. However, one way or the other, when you train with us, you will get these materials to you, like the standard. Then invest in training. Again, we're your go-to partners for that. And you establish an information security committee, which will be a cross-functional committee across things like IT, legal, operations, HR. And then you conduct a gap analysis. Basically, what is the gap analysis? Where you are as is, and what's the gap between where you are and where you should be. So, some of the takeaways are that information security rides on the bedrock of the CIA triad, which is the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Then ISO 27001 is universal, like we said, and it is proven, and we can see that it is growing globally. In 2021 alone, it had recorded a 32% growth. And then the ISMS is a systematic approach. We spoke about the plan, do, check, act cycle. You know, it's systematic, it's not random. Then we have 93 controls in Annex A across organizational, people, physical, and technological controls. So start now, engage leadership, get the standards, form your information security committee, conduct the gap analysis, and get in touch with Mitigate It Academy to train you.